Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna. I'll just wait, as usual, for people to join us and then we'll get started. Morning, Stuart. So welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna, the 76th in the series. My name is Lorna. I'm the Community Engagement Officer for the Highland Archive Service. If you've watched previously, you'll know we have 4 archive centres across the Highlands of Scotland, which together tell the story of the history of the Highlands. We have the Highland Archive Centre in Inverness, Skye and Lochailsh Archive Centre in Portree, Lochaber Archive Centre in Fort William, and Nucleus, the Nuclear and Caithness Archives in Wick. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of talks. If you are able to donate towards our work, then as I say every week, we really are grateful for that, and thank you to those of you who've been able to do that. It really means a lot to us. This week we are continuing our theme of life stories by looking at the life of Jane Durham. Jane Durham was a passionate preserver and conserver of Highland history, particularly buildings, monuments and features in the landscape such as standing stones. She is well remembered today and well spoken of, so if you are one of the many people who remembers Jane Durham, then please do share your memories of her or her husband Philip in our chat. We hold a large collection of papers amassed by Jane Durham. We also hold her husband's collections, but that's a separate one, so I'm not going to touch on that very much today. But we hold a large collection of Jane Durham's papers, research notes and correspondence and so on. Unusually, perhaps, this collection was deposited by her, also then subsequently by her husband and her son, one of her sons. But an interesting one in that many of the ones that we've looked at so far have been donated to us or given to us further down the line. But this collection was given by someone who was very aware of the importance of what she was doing at the time she was doing it. So who was Jane Durham? She was born Jane Mary Stowe Patterson, born on the 26th of May 1924 near Invergordon. And for those who are not in the Highlands, Invergordon is in Easter Ross in Ross and Cromarty, so the next county up from Inverness-shire. She spent the first few years of her life in Admiralty housing in Invergordon before moving to the family home of Ord Farm. Towards the end of her life, Jane wrote a short volume entitled A Brief History of Ord House and Farm Life in Easter Ross. It recalls some of her memories from the early days of her life, and I wanted to share with you the opening pages, which are, well, you'll see what I mean. They're written beautifully about a child's memories. So she writes, "My first 5 years were spent in the last house before the cottage brae, in the Admiralty houses which had been built in a hurry during the 1418 war, when homes were needed for senior naval officers. This was when Invergordon saw some of its busiest days ever as a base for the Grand Fleet. Few memories remain, but one rather appropriate one is the ugly grumbling noise coming across the water one fine morning when the fleet mutinied in 1928. It must have been a still day and the sound carried well. It was an exceedingly disagreeable sound and unforgettable. 2 others stand out. The Ballantor fishwife who came every week, walking along the seafront and up to the kitchen door with a big creel on her back. One day she gave me a lovely fat brown stick of dulse, a type of seaweed, to suck. It was delicious. The minute she went down the path, my mother removed it, saying it was dirty and unhygienic, and I was furious. The last memory I have of this time is purest happiness. I was playing with my dolls on the sloping grass in front of the house when I saw, walking along the road from the town, the 2 Moyer brothers, Kenny and Hughie, who were the sons of the biggest joiners in the place. They were carrying between them the most beautiful dappled grey wooden rocking horse with green rockers. As they neared, I realised with dawning delight that they might be coming to our house, because in those days there were no houses at all beyond Cottage Brae, only a field. They turned in, climbed up the steps rather delicately, and deposited the glorious creature in front of me. It is in the family still and must be well over 100 years old now. At the Ballantrade's sale of 1888, before the Forsyth family moved in as tenants. It was at the far end of the drawing room, full of furniture for sale. My father told me later how he had seen this wonderful rocking horse, scrambled over all the stacked furniture between him and it, and sat on it until late in the afternoon when my grandfather bought it for him and the rest of the Ord family. Later I had a Shetland pony called Black Bess, who was as stubborn and unreliable as most Shetland ponies generally are. I remember standing behind her, busily brushing her back legs when my father caught me, smacked me soundly for standing behind it, and sent me howling into the house. The lesson remains. My grandfather died at Ord in 1929, and some months later my father, who had been born there, and my mother, a Yorkshirewoman, moved there to live, along with myself, aged about 5, my brother Jim, who was 2.5, and our nanny, Christabel Ross. During the period of changeover, we spent some time in the Ballantor Hotel, and it was there that I had my first experience of the delight of solitude. It was early morning, and escaping from whoever had an eye on me, I had the most wonderful explore on the brown, rocky, seaweed-covered shore just in front of the hotel. The tide was out, and I can remember the texture of the dark, slithery strands of seaweed with the lovely fat bubbles, and how the tiny blue-grey crabs scuttled sideways when you poked them. It was all wonderful. After living in the comparatively small house on the seafront with a fenced-in garden and roads on 2 sides, moving to Ord was like moving to heaven, and so it has remained in my mind ever since. I wanted to share that entire extract because, as we'll see, that time at Ord turned into a very, very pivotal and influential time in her life. Ord Farm had been started as a farm in around about the 1840s. The first plan that Jane knew of that existed was in the 1860s, and her family had been there as tenants since 1882, when her grandparents took it over while establishing and running a timber merchant's business in Invergordon, A&G Patterson's, which ran for almost 100 years in the town. They also brought with them the man who would go on to become Jane Durham's great-grandfather, the man described in there, I think, who her father had to sit on the rocking horse until he arrived. By all accounts, he seems to have been a great character. Aged nearly 90, he kept a tame goose, which he took for a daily walk to the railway. The estate which the farm was part of was broken up between the 2 world wars. Of course, a time of change for so many different things, and land ownership and division often hit at this time as people were re-evaluating finances, family structures, and so on. And this had been the case in Jane's family. Her father had returned from the First World War to find that there had been financial mismanagement of the farm, and therefore had to pay off shares and all sorts of things to pay the debts. So Jane's father, William Grindley Patterson, bought the farm, and as that extract that I just read noted, it was there that the family lived for the rest of her childhood. That little book that I mentioned, A Brief History of Ord House and Farm Life in Easter Ross, recalls many of her earliest memories in that house. She talks of governesses and makes a point of saying there were some good and some terrible, and pets. She had puppies called Sandy and Jack. She had a lizard called Bill, who was named after the lizard in Alice in Wonderland, but her favourite pet of all of them was a ferret called Wilfred, who went everywhere with her. She talks about the flowers in the garden, how important the garden was to her, and I think you get that from that early extract of being outside and being in looking at the land and the scenery. And she talks about trips to the local shop. Now, I love this because she talks about 2 ladies who ran the shop who are known quite fabulously, I think, as the Fancy Biscuits. As the title of that little booklet suggests, these pages also deal her memories of the farming year. And I'm not going to go into that just now because I'll come back to that later in the year when we look at farming records particularly. When the Second World War struck, Jane was 15. She, of course, lived very close to Invergordon, and it was a substantial naval base, and that meant that the war sometimes came very close to home, and her memories included these extracts. The fleet appeared in the Firth periodically, a rather lovely sight. The town filled up with ladies of the oldest profession. During fleet occupations, the town seethed with life, but it didn't really affect us that much. They usually came in May and September. On May the 26th, Queen Mary's birthday, The ships were decorated with strings of flags and they fired a Royal 21-gun salute at noon. As I shared her birthday, it was all very gratifying for me. One much later memory is very clear. It was at the time of the Munich crisis, and we had been down to the Ballantor harbour to collect a salmon. It was the first time it had dawned on us children that something was a bit abnormal. My father and the fishermen were standing and talking at length in an unusually grave manner. Suddenly it seemed to me as if things really might be going hideously wrong. A queer feeling started in the pit of my stomach. Up until then, I had always considered the grown-ups' conversation to be gloomy and wordy and had paid little attention to it. We'd heard of Hitler, but despite our mother's attempts to interest us in world affairs through the children's newspapers, we know no more than his name. But in the car coming home, Father told me that the Ballantor men had relations in the fleet and had been told by them that they had all been given sealed orders. Shore leave had been cancelled and the fleet was waiting to leave. The orders were to be opened at sea. Early that September evening we were playing croquet on the lawn after supper. It was a still slightly misty evening, and out of the stillness we heard the grinding noise of the big ship's anchors being raised. First we watched Hood and Nelson, ships too large to come right into the firth, swing round out of their Cromarty moorings and slide out through the Souters. They were followed by long lines of cruisers and then destroyers, who used to moor up as near as Alness, last of all. It was a dreadfully final and ominous, and of course by the end of the war we no longer had a fleet of those proportions, and Invergordon never saw a sight like that again. Even when in the 50s the Queen held a review of the fleet at Invergordon, it was a shadow of its former glory. The dockyard and oil tank depot combined with the fleet's visits gave work to Invergordon for most of my childhood. When the hill above Invergordon was hollowed out to be made into an oil tank, it gave a lot of work. However, gradually all of that vanished. I think that's a really evocative first-hand account of all of those ships turning, the destroyers, the cruisers, leaving, and the sound of the anchors being pulled, and knowing that those men are going somewhere with orders that they are not allowed to open until they're at sea is quite extraordinary, I think. Jane had originally had aspirations to work in fashion design, but this ambition was abandoned because of the war, and she joined the Wrens instead. And World War II was a turning point for Jane in another way too, as this was when she met the man who would go on to become her husband, Lieutenant Colonel Phil Durham. Philip Durham was also a fascinating man in his own right, and as I said, I'm not going to go into all his story, which is equally interesting. But when the war broke out, he was aged 18. He quickly had joined the Royal Navy and had served with distinction, notably capturing a German U-boat and subsequently serving on it. He also served on Malta convoys, amongst other things. The Durhams married in 1947, but at the young age of 26, so while still incredibly young and involved in the Navy, Philip Durham contracted polio and he became a wheelchair user at the age of 26. And although this cut short a further military career, it doesn't seem to have hampered him in any other ways, as we'll see. So Jane and Philip married in 1947, and then in 49-50 they went to South Africa, for which trip we have Jane's diaries. The diaries talk about visiting family members, there's a particularly beautiful section where Jane comments on the amazing beauty of the people that she met, the physical beauty. She talks about seeing the most striking man and woman in native South African dress, and just how struck she was at how incredibly beautiful they were. She talks about their skill at intricate beadwork and noted with intense sadness the rapidly deteriorating political and racial situation in South Africa at that time, because of course she was there 49-50, apartheid started in 1948, and so she comments on that fact that something very dangerous and very awful is about to happen. After their marriage, Jane and Philip moved into Scotsburn House, which was a 1,300-acre farm with both livestock and hill farming. And it was in the late 1960s that the next event would happen, which would really shape Jane Durham's life and her future work. Ord Farm, which her family home, which she had described so beautifully in those extracts, was bought by British Aluminium, and the land was turned over for use when the smelter was built. Now, if you are familiar with Invergordon, then I'm sure you will have some memories and some opinions on the time that the smelter was in Invergordon. If you're not familiar with that story, then please do go back and watch the Learn with Lorna that I did about the importance of the aluminium industry to the Highlands. So Ord Farm, that place that she talks about with so much affection, was sold to British Aluminium. And of course the smelter brought jobs and it brought money, but something had been lost, and then of course the smelter really lasted barely a decade anyway. And this is how Jane, in her memoirs, describes her memory of the time that the family home was sold. The smelter came and ended life as Ord. I'll start that again. The smelter came and ended the life of Ord as a farm, though British Aluminium retained the land and farmed the residue. And it was this, as I watched the beautiful land disappearing forever under concrete, that moved me to try and find out how it had come about and what had been there before. People assumed very largely that the development money we as a family received for the farm made up for everything. It helped, of course it did. But the love of the land is a very deep-seated emotion, and oddly enough, at the end of the day, it was losing the garden that hurt the most, far more than anything else. My father died a fortnight before the land was zoned for industry. This meant that we were able to inscribe born, farmed and died at Ord on his headstone. That helped a great deal. He never believed that the smelter would actually come. Jane had campaigned for this not to happen. She had campaigned for the land not to be sold for the smelter, but had failed in that campaign, and the land was indeed sold. But from that moment on, in addition to raising her family, in addition to farming at Scotsburn with her husband, Jane devoted herself almost exclusively, I think voluntarily, to preserving the heritage of the Highlands and the heritage of Scotland further afield. One of her early successes was campaigning to save the original Tain Academy building. Her father had attended school in Tain Academy. The building's foundation stone had been laid in 1810, and the building had opened to pupils in 1813. It was described over the next few decades as a great embellishment to the town, one of the handsomest and chastest buildings in the north of Scotland. So a substantial and important building, and again a building for which we hold the records. We hold the records that talk of Tain Academy being built, the discussions around that, where the money was come from. It was another building, as you may remember from my talk on our slavery connection, another building which was partially funded by money from the Caribbean and various other places, but a substantial building. By the early 1970s, the building had served as a school for nearly 160 years and was under threat of demolition. The new Tain Academy had been opened in 1969, and so there was no longer felt to be any need for this building. But Jane, along with others, campaigned for the building to remain. And in October 1972 it was given Category B listed status, and in 1980 it was converted into a care home, which it remains to this day, and it remains a very striking and beautiful building. A number of other buildings were saved due to Jane's efforts, Roskeen Church and various others. In the 1970s, as well as campaigning and working to save these buildings, Jane opened, along with a friend, a restoration business, so a business designed to support other people to save and restore houses and other buildings, while still running the 1,300 acre farm and raising 3 sons. It was also at this time in the 1970s that Jane became a Fellow of the Society of the Antiquaries of Scotland. She would go on to become a council member. She also went on to become, if you know of any more of these, please do chip in, but I have to read you the list of things that I'm aware of that Jane Durham, offices that she held. She was the Vice President of the Agricultural Heritage Society of Scotland. She was a member of the Scottish Historic Buildings Trust, President of the Tyne and Easter Ross Civic Trust, Chair of the Scottish Vernacular Buildings Group, Trustee of the Highland Building Preservation Trust, Custodian of St Duthas Collegiate Church, Director of Alban Housing Association, Director of Cromarty Arts Trust. I mean, do feel free to shout out if you know of any more roles that she held. But you may remember when we looked at sporting records, we talked about the football records. And I said there that there are types of people like that who are absolutely fundamental to groups, committees, societies. They just work away in the background all the time, ensuring that those things can continue in sporting associations. And this is exactly the same. And Jenny, I'm seeing your comment saying you feel inadequate. Never feel inadequate. But if you know anyone like that, if you know someone who is fundamental to the continuation and the existence of things, please do tag them and let them see that work is appreciated, because I think so often, and I had a father who was one of these people, so often those people carry very, very many things in the background. So if you know of people like that, do tell them that their work's appreciated. Another role that Jane took on with great passion was the establishment of the Scottish Redundant Churches Trust, of which she was a trustee. This was established after Jane realised that there was no official system in Scotland to protect abandoned churches. England had a system in place, but Scotland did not. And as congregations were changing, amalgamating, or moving to newer buildings, the churches were becoming abandoned, because the Church of Scotland, or the Free Church, whichever it was, whichever church she was dealing with, the Church of Scotland and the Free Churches of Scotland responsibility was for the continuation of worship rather than the preservation of unused buildings. They had, of course, a duty to look after the buildings that were in use, but if they weren't in use, then there was a confusion over whose responsibility that was. And Jane trawled through church records, council legislation, Church of Scotland legislation, but could find no definitive answer about who it was who held responsibility for buildings that were no longer used. And she says in her notes, perhaps my reading has been inadequate, maybe I've missed something, but certainly in what I've done, I've not been able to find a clear answer. She concluded, possibly rightly, that perhaps the Kirk Sessions, when they had put in the structure, perhaps they had simply never envisaged a time when the buildings currently in use wouldn't be in use, because they had survived for hundreds of years. Maybe it just hadn't occurred that one day those buildings would not be needed, or that newer buildings would be used. And this is an extract from a paper that Jane wrote to gather support for the creation of a group to tackle this responsibility. Where a building is not covered by title, there is a lack of statutory responsibility that is very hard to overcome. There remains some little stone-walled graveyards in parts of Ross and Cromarty that appear almost totally neglected, and are so covered in ivy and nettles that they are almost impossible to access. I should guess that their deeds are non-existent. Lochcarron and Ardvrec leap to mind. The present councils are understandably nervous of the possible expenditure that might be demanded of a systematic programme of churchyard repair, were this to fall to their lot. Yet amongst all the money that is spent on heritage, interpretive, illusionary, or merely tourist trapping, a small amount of money spent on the graveyards in their buildings would be money spent on the truest heritage of all. The gravestones, properly read, furnish country districts with a pretty complete who lived where for the late 17th century onwards, and this accurate source of information is very frequently ignored. The three most important churches in Easter Ross are possibly Tarbert, Nig Old Church, and Edderton, with Kilmuir Easter as a runner-up. None of these has any original deeds. All, with the exception of Kilmuir Easter, have Pictish symbol stones. In the case of Tarbert, fragments of many stones of various dates. The Picts were very strong on sculpture but weak on script, and these stones, together with a small amount of metalwork, are the only tangible remains of the Pictish kingdoms which governed northern Scotland for some hundreds of years. These carved stones, thought by some to be original preaching stones, testify to the meeting of the Christian and Pictish beliefs, and although there is ongoing discussion on their interpretation, generally any church which has one is a very old site indeed. It came into being long before people felt a need for deeds. Ederton is a case in point. It has a very famous stone leaning at an angle in the graveyard, and no deeds at all, the reason given by both the Church of Scotland and the Free Church for disclaiming any responsibility. In 1842 the congregation built themselves a very fine new church to seat 600 and left Ederton empty. 4 years later, in the turmoil of the disruption, a large proportion of the congregation abandoned the new church. Legend says that during a wild snowstorm they felt rather chilly and leant on the door of Ederton Old Church, which burst in. They then borrowed it for 100 years, vacating it for Tain in 1971. They retained it for communion until the 1980s, when they departed finally for Tain, taking with them the clock, which after all they had probably installed, and leaving behind, underneath a blocked up gallery, the original wooden preaching ark. This must be a very rare, if not unique, survival. Resembling the hull of an upturned boat with sides built to raise and protect the minister from the elements, it has a desk for the Bible and appears to be intact. The interior of Ederton is quite simple and very complete, strong and typical of its date, although these too are becoming rare today. Ederton is a typical example of a church that has simply slipped through the net of care. So you can see that this document goes on to list all the churches in Ross and Cromarty that have slipped through the net, that the Church of Scotland is no longer responsible for, the Free Church is not responsible, the county's not responsible, so who is? And it was the passion of Jane Durham and others like her that resulted in the creation of the Scottish Redundant Churches Trust, which is still in operation and is now known as the Historic Churches Scotland. They are a charity whose entire role is to save churches that are at risk. So the buildings, preserve their story and secure them in some way for their local community. So this is making them into galleries, into cafes, into museums, into whatever it might be. It's to preserve the fabric of the building and the story that that building has witnessed. In 1984, Jane Durham took on one of her proudest roles. She became a commissioner with the Royal Commission on Ancient and Historic Monuments of Scotland, ARCAMS, which merged with Historic Scotland in 2015 to become Historic Environment Scotland. This was a very high-profile role and one of which she was incredibly proud. She served in this role for 10 years until 1994, when she stepped down and was subsequently awarded an MBE for her in the New Year's Honours List for her services to heritage and conservation. Jane Durham died incredibly sadly in an accident in April 1997 at the age of 73, to the great sadness of a lot of people, and that comes across in the collection as well. She left behind her a large collection of papers, research notes and correspondence about many parts of the Highlands, and of course her legacy can also be found in the buildings that are still standing thanks to her efforts and her passion and her belief that their story mattered. I hope you've enjoyed finding out a little bit about Jane Durham and the collection that she left behind. As I say, it's extensive and full of all sorts of aspects of the story of the Highlands, particularly through its material culture and buildings. Next week, I hope you can join me. We will be looking at Lord Lovat, an interesting character. We hold a number of letters of his in our Lochaber Archive Centre, and that's what we'll be looking at next week. So I hope you can join me then. But in the meantime, a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. That High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in the Learn with Lorna talks. But thank you to those of you who have been able to donate, and if you would like to go on and donate towards our work to ensure that we can carry on taking in these collections and using them and sharing them, then there's a link to be able to do so in the body of the text. If you're interested in going back and watching any of the ones I've mentioned there, aluminium and so on, then please do go and have a look at the High Life Highland YouTube channel. All 75 previous episodes are on there. Thank you very much for joining me.